Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The Trumps are in China. What could possibly go wrong? The ruling Communist Party has just completed a successful Congress, and President Xi now has his thoughts enshrined in ideology, alongside Chairman Mao and Deng Xiaoping.
China has the biggest population in the world, the biggest economy, and the biggest army. So are we now likely to begin to hear rather more from the People's Republic?
Joining us to discuss this is the author of a brand new and splendid book called Becoming China, the Story Behind the State. She's Jeanne-Marie Gescher, barrister and China specialist who's lived and worked in the country for almost 30 years. Welcome to the show. The book is a showstopper, not just because of the size of it, but the scholarship that's in it is simply awesome. Tell us, first of all, why did you go to China and why did you stay 30 years?
Oh, wow. Okay. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Welcome.
I went to China because I thought China would be a very interesting place to watch that process of development. So if you think back to the 1980s, people were thinking about how to do development. There were various different theories. What was kind of interesting about all of them was they were all only about economics. I couldn't quite work that out. But there were two big competing theories, trickle down or bottom up. I thought that China would be the place that would have the deliberation to think about what development was. So I went. As it happened, I arrived a week after Tiananmen. I arrived on a plane, the only person going in, everybody else was coming out. It was quite a big plane. I was the only one on it. As people were leaving, they were saying, you know, why are you here? It's all over. What happened next was that for the next few years, in the quiet after Tiananmen, the world's embassies and its media sent the greatest sinologists. Meanwhile, many of the foreigners had left. So I was able to have 2 years of extraordinary conversations with Chinese from all sorts of different backgrounds and, as I said, some of the world's greatest sinologists. Over time, I set up a business. I set up one of the earliest advisory firms in China. And I was very interested in development. My background is as a competition lawyer, but I'm actually really interested in development as in how we develop as human beings. We got to do some extraordinary projects, mostly because there were not very many other people doing what we were doing there. And over time, I realized that the big question in China was not so much development, although that was, you know, we were looking at mass rapid development. I would go away from Beijing for a couple of weeks, come back, it was a whole new city. Wow. So that was an extraordinary thing to live through. But in the background was always this question about order, about how you mentioned, Gayatri mentioned how big the population of China is. And Chinese would always say, you know, we've got a very big population. I was thinking, you know, obviously it's a very big population. But the consequences of that, and I think as we approach a world of, you know, going on to 8 billion people, this is something for us to bear in mind. The consequences of a very big population are significant. And one of them is that you think a lot about order. You know, how do all these human beings live together in peace and security? I think it's something we should think about everywhere, but as it happens, we're talking about China. So I went to look at development, and I found this extraordinary question about really what it means to be human, as in how do we live together. I fell in love with China the very first time I went. I went to teach at Peking University in the late 1980s, around 1987. In the old days, there was a very simple airport with just one runway and one road, and the road was shaded with willow trees. And there were only donkey carts going up and down it, very few cars. And you had this extraordinary sense of a place that had obviously been through great trauma, but was also a place with extraordinary ideas. So it was possible then just to walk into the Forbidden City. It was open and empty. I always say when people are going to China, the best thing to do, actually, is to go to Beijing and go to the Forbidden City, and then close your eyes and run to Taipei in Taiwan, because many of the things that were in the Forbidden City went out to Taiwan before 1949, before the Second Revolution. And then you can get an understanding of what was really a living culture. So when you know, in those early years in particular, what you saw in Beijing was the architecture of that culture, but you didn't see so much of the furniture of that culture. So if you go back to the beginning of time, it was shamans who settled the Chinese people, the people who became the Chinese, who were around the banks of the Yellow River, as it was shamans who settled all of us. They looked at the sky and they looked at the earth and tried to work out how things worked. They eventually worked out the schedule of the seasons, and they were able to settle the people and create what became a huge and very successful agricultural economy. In the process of doing that, they thought deeply about how human beings could live together. They thought very deeply about this question of order. They believed that there were 3 + 1 really important things. One was that if we wanted to understand anything, we needed to have empathy. If you think about it, the hardest things we have to understand, we can only really understand if we fall in love with them. put ourselves in the shoes of that thing or that person, and we will understand it. Integrity, the name of a thing should correspond to its purpose, is a kind of idea about truth. Discipline as a virtue, we should actually cultivate ourselves. And then this idea, which in Chinese is called go, which is the investigation of things, which is we should investigate things, but with those three qualities of empathy, integrity, and self-discipline.
That's a pretty good slogan. Sun Yat-sen said that China, without a strong central state, is a tray of sand blowing in the wind. The strong central state has been provided since 1949, especially in the last 3 decades, by the Communist Party, which just reconsolidated its power the other week in the Congress. That's set fair, isn't it? That's not going to change. For those, perhaps in the City of London, a mile from here, dreaming of a disintegration of the central state, a toppling of the Communist Party, that's not going to happen, is it?
I think it's unlikely in the foreseeable future. I think there are risks. Anybody familiar with Chinese history will be very familiar with these cycles of great expansion and then collapse. One thing I'd like to add, just going back to that story of the shamans, was at a certain point they split between men who believed that the world was so complex that we had to learn to cultivate ourselves, and others who believed it was just better and more efficient to have one person at the top telling everybody what to do. That story of China is a 5,000-line fault line between those who believe that the best way to have order is to have, if you like, a son of heaven figure, a figure at the top who commands everything, but with that investigation of things and those qualities, and those who believe that actually, given the importance of the changes, the fact that the opposite of everything is within itself, we live in a very complex world, we have to learn to cultivate ourselves, and we can only do that with voices on the ground. But it's never been an idea of one man, one vote. So if democracy, when people talk about democracy in China, is something very different. Now, the issue that we have now, I think, is threefold. One is that the West, and I think your point about the City of London, which is only a mile from here, is a very good one, and I would include New York and all the other cities of the world, is that they have simply not listened to what Xi Jinping has been saying for the last 5 years. There has been this expectation that there'd be greater economic reform. Xi Jinping has talked a little bit about it. He's talked much more about politics. He's talked much more about what we heard him say 2 weeks ago at the 19th Congress, which is a new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Chinese dream, yeah?
And that Chinese dream, well, that Chinese dream is a dream of utopia that goes back 5,000 years. It has toppled many imperial dynasties. It's a belief that there should be a golden age of freedom and equality. That's a dream it's a fairly universal dream. How do we realize that dream? And we come back to, maybe the single top-down mind will deliver it. But always a single top-down mind falls victim to the problem that a single top-down mind becomes an echo chamber. And that's how we've seen. So China has divided in the past. There's a wonderful quote at the beginning of a book, a great novel called The Romance of Three Kingdoms, which says that the empire, long united, must divide, long divided must unite. So this idea of China breaking apart is one that Chinese people feel very deeply and are very concerned about.
I want to move you on to this day.
Yes.
The Trumps out there.
Yes.
What could possibly go wrong? Trump came to power shaking his fist at China. China was stealing America's lunch and so on. Have they kissed and made up on this journey? And what will the future be between Donald Trump and President Xi?
Gosh, I'm going to start with a question about Trump and Trump's ability to represent America. So I think we're living in very strange times where an American president goes to China, and I'm just not sure that he's representing American interests, whether he will be
or
there.
Whether he'll still be in power
whether he'll be in
when he
power
gets
in a year's
back.
time, and what happens after Trump. So I think we have to, and if I have those questions, then China has those questions too. I think China, as everybody else in the world, is slightly confused about Trump, but coming to realise that this is a man who has a very strange idea of ruling, which is the antithesis of that Chinese idea of investigating things and all of those qualities. What they've seen is an America which, whether naturally or under Trump, is beginning to be much more concerned about a sense that China has behaved unfairly to the West, with consequences in terms of international trade and investment. There have been some rather strident articles published in the American press in the last few days that confirm that this is a wider view than just Trump. So looking at that, we can see that what China has done has been to deliver, billions of dollars of trade deals that will be good for Trump to be able to report back home. That happens with every president, actually, and some of them new, some are old, some may never happen, but that's a common occurrence. What they're also doing, no doubt, is putting forward a number of deals for the Trump family, that's a huge risk. You know, China has always wanted to engage with a family in America as well. There never was a family to engage with. Well, now we have one. More importantly, I think for everybody in China and the West, North Korea is a very big issue. And the difficulty that China has is in understanding, A, what Trump's position is, and then probably concluding that it's going to flip-flop, and then B, who behind Trump has a voice and whether those voices will still be there. Xi Jinping is trying very hard to be very statesmanlike about this visit. I was very concerned when I think Trump tweeted...
And he's got twice the number of characters now.
Has he?
They've doubled the 140 to 280. Yeah. For Trump was one of the first.
Right, yes.
So he's got twice the space to wreck the international system.
I think, yes, it does. I mean, he managed to do quite a good job on 140, don't you think? But I think that what the Communist Party now is trying to do is to manage Trump with all those uncertainties. They will try very hard to rebalance. I think they have. You know, a lot of investments in America being done, which is probably about time. You know, China has grown enormously. I'm a little bit concerned about the idea that, you know, China has stolen from the West. This has been a long issue. I'm not saying true or not true, but the world is a complicated place. We've been building a global economy. The West has not listened to Xi Jinping saying for the last 5 years, I see things slightly differently. So this is all coming as rather of shock. I'm much more concerned when I hear Trump saying, well, you know, China is now my new best friend, having said that he was going to China to tell the Chinese that they needed to kind of buck up their ideas. And so that will say to the Chinese that this man, clearly, but we all know this man flip-flops. And a flip-flopping leader is a danger.
Look, it's a fantastic book. The very best of luck with it.
Much.
And good luck when you go back to China, as you frequently, of course, now do. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Coming up next, Lost in Paradise, $10 trillion. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. When John Milton wrote Paradise Lost in 1667, he couldn't have imagined the £10 million Her Majesty the Queen had invested in the jungles of Panama.
When Bono told us he still hadn't found what he was looking for, he didn't tell us it was a shopping mall in Lithuania.
And when world champion racing driver Lewis Hamilton, wrapped in a British flag, wondered why nobody loved him here, we didn't know his private jet had merely touched down in the Isle of Man for 30 minutes so he could patriotically rob the British exchequer of £3 million in VAT. Joining us to root around the undergrowth of the Paradise Papers is Professor Steve Keen of Kingston University and author of the best economics book in the world. It's called Debunking Economics, and nobody debunks them better than Steve. Professor, first of all, most people know that rich people hide their wealth as best they can. Nobody knew Her Majesty the Queen and her heir to the throne would be amongst them. Was that the #1 shock in the papers for you?
I'm not shocked by any of this. It's the #1. They've got their pants out, their underpants around their ankles at the moment. That's the good thing about it. But in terms of being shocked by it, I'd be shocked if they didn't, because when you have that much wealth, they're paranoid about letting anybody have any of it whatsoever. And therefore they are very susceptible to anybody who says, I can find a way for you to minimise tax, which is another way of saying, I can find a way for you to pay no tax whatsoever, and just pay me a large fee. And therefore the piranhas are the ones who are really the worry. The sharks will always be there. It's the piranhas that are encouraging them to put their money offshore.
Well, you see, I am shocked. You may say unusual in someone of my years. But I am shocked that the very richest people are actually the very greediest people. I ask the question all the time, how much money do they need?
It really is as bizarre.
How many houses do you want? How many fancy cars?
Yeah, I mean,
look, I personally know one of these characters, actually, of the lot. I've got a lot more time for than many of the others, once I give them a name necessarily. But he had a 120-foot racing yacht, and it wasn't good enough, so he bought himself a 160-foot racing yacht, which, as well as being a racing yacht, had space on it for a baby grand piano. Now, none of us can even imagine a world like that. But they get to the stage where that's what they see as their entitlement. They're also preparing themselves for a future that they think might not be exactly a good one. And they also, it's comparative. So you'll see them when they line their yachts up at Cairns and wherever else. If Larry Ellison from Oracle finds himself next to Bill Gates and Bill Gates' yacht's bigger, Larry wants a bigger yacht. And I'm not joking. I'm not sure it was Bill Gates, but it was Ellison.
Yeah.
Exactly that reaction. He got himself a bigger yacht.
Wow. Well, I mean, en passant, let me say that when the crown is robbing the crown,
That's true.
Yeah, that's joking,
it has
though.
entered a surreal
It's
level.
become farcical.
We gave the Queen the money, which she then hid in a tax shelter and invested in a down-market off-license chain through that vehicle so that she wouldn't have to pay the exchequer, her own exchequer, back even a small percentage of the profits in tax. I take your point. Scorpions sting because they're scorpions.
Very good.
Exactly.
And rich people do this because they are rich people. The real mugs are us.
Letting them get away with it.
We're letting them get away with it. How could we stop it?
We can't stop it by international treaties. We can't stop it by appeals to their better nature, etc., etc. We can only stop it by changing the tax system, because the fact that they can declare profits as their income, we declare wages. Now, you've got a wage check, that's exactly the amount of money you earn, okay? And you earn it wherever you're working. You can't say, I'm in London and I earned this money in Panama. Okay. But if you earn profit, you can restructure yourself such that you'll have a subsidiary over here, which happens to be where you make 90% of your profits. And that building, that 5-story building in the Cayman Islands that apparently had, 22,000 companies working out of it. Okay, 22,000 in a 5-story building.
Some of the biggest companies in the world.
I know, but I actually saw
They
the
all fit there,
I know. I saw the predecessor to that building about 20 years ago. I went to the Cayman Islands on a holiday and specifically wanted to go and see the particular building that I knew was the one. And that stage was I think it was a 2-story building, whitewashed outside, gold plaques on the outside. I counted 20 or 30 before I got sick of counting the gold plaques. They don't bother those anymore. But it was News Corporation was there, Rupert Murdoch's mob. I think Oracle was there. And that particular building, I knew that Rupert Murdoch declared, I think, about 70% of his profits out of that building. Now, when I got there was nobody in it.
Wow.
Okay? It is all a ruse, and they're always going to win that game.
Yeah.
So how can we tackle that?
I think we've got to tax them on transactions, not on profits. And if they complain about it, tough. But one of the reasons it would work is we think the mistake we make is believing we've got to tax to have the revenue to finance what the state does. And therefore, we think if we don't tax them, we don't get enough money back, and we're always trying to claw the money back out of them. And they'll claim that, if you tax us too much, we won't have the money. The reality is governments spend because they are governments. They create the money. And taxation is only necessary to stop the government pumping an amount of money into the economy, which would be the equivalent of 30% or 40% of GDP every year. Because they're fiat governments, they create the money. They don't need to tax to get it in the first place. They create it. What you tax for is to take it out of circulation, because if you left it in circulation, you'd have runaway inflation. Now, that says, let's forget about the getting revenue for the state attitude about it. Let's just we want to set a level of taxation that means the rate of government money creation, which governments need to create money when economies are growing, should be so many % per year. We simply set the transactions up in that way, and we tax the corporations on transactions where they occur.
Tell me what you mean on transactions. You mean every time they buy something, every time they pay somebody wages, every time they order a piece of kit or whatever?
It could be very, very small rate, but you're simply saying we're taking
money. Is that not VAT?
No, it's not VAT. VAT is charged on the buyer. Okay, this would be charged onto the company doing the transaction. The danger is at the same time, you still can't be sure what the incidence is going to be of things like this. We live in a very complex system. This is the nature of a capitalist economy. And that complexity can mean you can put a charge here and the dynamics mean it actually gets carried by somebody else. So, for example, in my own work, I've modelled Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. I have a model where the firms borrow money and the firms pay interest. Guess who ends up paying the debt cost? The workers. Because what happens is capitalist income sort of bounces along at about an equilibrium level. Workers' income goes down as the debt share goes up. So even though it's the firms borrowing the money and the firms paying the interest, in terms of income shares, the workers are the ones who end up paying for it. So you can't be sure where this is going to fall. And I think in some way, I'd like to model and test this out to see what the particular incidents would be. But the main thing is you want the government to be creating enough money to mean we have jobs, we have health, we have welfare, and then stopping those processes causing runaway inflation. To focus on tax as a source of income is actually a mistake that they end up exploiting because we can do nothing about it.
Now, tell us about your work in general. You are, without a doubt, an absolutely top-drawer economist. You're a rock and roll kind of economist, and you're kind of now moving your work onto a different level. Tell us about that.
Yeah, again, I've been shot by neoliberalism because the government has changed the rules for first-year intake to make it more like a market. You know, the students are informed consumers of university degrees.
Right.
Well, of course, therefore, they take the Russell groups and they ignore places which are post-92. So Kingston student intake has plummeted. We can't sustain our program anymore. So I've decided to go out and be crowd-funded. I've had enough of bureaucrats telling me how to be an academic.
Crowd-funded economist.
Yep.
That's a fantastic idea. How are you going to do that?
With Patreon, which is a new website that is a bit like a continuous time version of Kickstarter and Indiegogo. So rather than supporting a particular project, people say, I'm going to say as little as $1 a month, as much as 100, which is the most anybody's giving right now. And they support me because they like the work that I'm doing in the same way you might support an artist because you like the music they play. You wouldn't want me to play music. So it's crowd-funded economist, and it gives me complete independence from any political, social influences. I write for Russia Today as well. That's just to annoy them.
Yeah, you're like me. You're one of the useful idiots.
Yeah.
Like me, we're the best educated useful idiots in history.
We are.
At least you are. Patreon is a tremendous
It's
platform.
a fantastic, yeah.
We're about to go on it ourselves in the United States.
I recommend it. I mean, they take their share, they take their 5%, PayPal takes another 5%, but the huge infrastructure there mean that if you are an artist and you do want to take a risk with what you do and you have a public that supports you, then it's a way of getting that continuous
And they
support.
get exclusive. Yeah, they get
I find I've got a very intelligent community. I learn a lot from them, as well as, them financing what I do.
They're learning from you, too.
Their ideas come back to me, which are fabulous.
What it does, though, is destroy the idea of tenure. Is that a good thing? I mean, you had, as a university professor, security for the rest of your life. I'm not so sure that's a good thing.
Tenure's supposed to be there to encourage people to be rebels, fundamentally, to break
But it doesn't.
It doesn't. Most of them, by the time they've gone through the steps that are necessary to achieve tenure, they've become so compliant to the system they're in, they dare not stick their necks out. If there was a tenure effect, then you might see people who are conservative up to the point where they go to tenure suddenly becoming critics on. No, most of them, they continue mouthing the same stuff on the other side.
They do, yeah, the prevailing orthodoxy. I haven't met many rebel professors, but you are the rebel without a pause. Professor Steve, I look forward to helping to crowdfund you in due course. Keep us posted about it. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So, the future of China and USA under Trump, to be specific. Roger the Dodger says both economies are umbilically linked. Trump may shout and bluster publicly, but he knows the rich and powerful. He truly represents all benefits from closer ties with China.
It is a big climb down Trump's made, actually. You think of his campaign rhetoric. China stealing our lunch, I'm going to deal with China and so on. And then he gets there and makes a speech and says,
yes.
I'm not actually blaming China.
Yeah, so how do you think the people in the US, back in the US, think about that?
Well, I think your correspondent is right. People in the US know that the United States would collapse without China, which actually holds more US dollars than the US Treasury does.
Quite. Now, Paradise Papers. Which of the revelations, who of them was the most surprising tax avoider? Is it the Queen, Prince Charles, Lewis Hamilton, or Bono? Jordan Peacock says, well, it's not Hamilton because he's been living in a tax haven for at least 10 years. So I'd go with the Queen and Prince Charles.
It has to be, you know.
No, it's shocking.
It is beyond surreal that the Crown is effectively robbing the Crown of its just share of profits.
I don't even know how that
in
can
an
be legal.
off-license. I don't. No, I mean, I suppose the Queen owns the courts and owns the Parliament, so I'm not quite sure how anybody would prosecute it anyway.
Right, that's the way Kevork Malikian, our dear friend, put it.
The esteemed actor.
Exactly. He said, what a wonderful world for some who don't have enough.
Well, it never ceases to amaze me, whatever Professor Keynes says, that the very richest people are the very meanest people.
And that's all the time we've got for the tweets today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today, or on Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.